Kitagawa. I'm the Chief Curator of Asian Art here at the Jordan Schnitzer Museum of Art, and I'm very, very happy to welcome you this evening to a very special lecture by our visiting consulting conservator, Beth Szuhay, who's been spending a large part of the past 2 years here working with us in storage on our textile collection. Everybody who comes to the art museum sees all the exhibitions that are going on upstairs, but what you don't see are all the exciting things that go on below decks. And what happens down there is our collections management team, curators, faculty, and students spend time studying the historic objects in our collection. This museum was very fortunate to get an IMLS grant from the US government in order to spend 2 years very carefully assessing the condition and working out treatment proposals for our large and distinguished collections of Asian textiles and Asian paintings. Because our Asian textile collection is vast, it meant that our consulting conservator had to come and spend a good deal of time with us. And we are preparing to be bereft because Beth has spent, I think, a total, it will be of 4 months, staying here in Eugene, leaving her family in California, and spending all day, every day, surveying our collections. Beth Szuhay is, she graduated from Winterthur University of Delaware's program in art conservation and was an associate conservator at the Fine Arts of San Francisco for 10 years before launching her own business, Chrysalis Art Conservation. We are so very pleased that she's here with us today to talk about textiles, textile conservation, and some of the scary things that lurk inside fabric. So with that, thank you so much, Beth.
Thank you very much, Anne Rose. Good evening. As a textile conservator in private practice, I have the benefit of working with a variety of institutions. Over the last 2 years, I have had the pleasure of conducting a condition survey at the Jordan Schnitzer Museum of Art's collection of Asian textiles, as Anne Rose pointed out, and working with the dedicated staff and student volunteers. And as she mentioned, it is starting to come to a close, and I'm already feeling a sense of loss. I will get over that. Just to give you a brief overview, I have organized this talk in a way that I hope will both explain the components of a conservation survey and its benefit to the museum, as well as basic care and handling of textiles that you can use for your own home collections. The conservation survey is one of those tasks that isn't very sexy from a development standpoint because the work goes largely unnoticed by the public. When the survey is over, there is no one's name on the wall of a gallery expansion or an acknowledgement of support at the entrance to an exhibition. In fact, most of conservation is invisible if done right. Instead, what is gained from a conservation survey is a large amount of information that can then be used to advance the use of the collection, either through further research or through uncovering a gem that will soon go on display. And in fact, for example, one of the gems that the survey uncovered are the sleeve bands that are currently on view in the upstairs galleries. The finished survey will also help to inform the staff of how to improve storage and display conditions, identify textiles in need of conservation, and maybe even for possible deaccession. So you might be asking yourself, what is a conservator, and how does that differ from a curator? A conservator is a museum professional who cares for the physical well-being of the historic or artistic works of art in order to preserve it for future generations. A conservator studies chemistry and physics to understand how materials break down and how repair techniques will affect the art, as well as employ analytical techniques that will help determine the artwork's authenticity and provenance. They study art history in order to understand what the correct interpretation of the art most likely is, or at least know what kinds of questions to ask the curator, so that their intervention measures do not misrepresent the art. And they study studio art in order to understand and develop the techniques used in their chosen area of specialty. Curators are museum professionals who study art history and anthropology in order to interpret works of art. They put the art in context of an artist or culture's body of work and disseminate that knowledge through exhibitions and publications. And we are looking at a dissected 19th century Burmese court costume. So you can see in this slide of my conservation colleague, Denise Migdale, and Chief Curator Forrest McGill of the Asian Art Museum in San Francisco, how conservators and curators work together to determine the priorities for the collection. The conservator uses analytical techniques to identify materials used in making the artwork, which assists the curator in putting the artwork in context and interpreting the artwork, which in turn helps the conservator make informed treatment decisions. So here, Forrest is describing how the correct shape for the costume should appear and how the mount should look to him. And Denise is working to make sure that the costume is supported on the mount. And I'm just going to pause and tell you that you will not see me in a lot of these photos because I'm usually the one taking the photograph, just so you know. And so this is the final outcome. Textiles, for the most part, are unable to support themselves. So by creating a form to put the costume in this shape gives a much different understanding than the dissected version we saw earlier. For a survey of a collection owned by a university museum, and in particular this university museum, it is assumed that the collection will spend time in storage, time on display, and time handled for teaching and research. It is also assumed that the objects will be in museum conditions and handled by museum professionals. So in other words, they're not going to be worn by humans, they're not going to be used for party decorations, and so on. So what are museum conditions? The ideal environment within the museum is a standard worldwide, actually, which is about 70 degrees Fahrenheit and 55% relative humidity. Now, this is a compromise temperature and relative humidity because we also have to make it practical for human visitors and staff to work in the museum. But we try to make it not too warm or dry to cause the objects to desiccate, and not too cool or humid to cause mold. The temperature and humidity are kept constant through the air conditioning system in the museum. Now, this is a hydrothermal graph, which helps record fluctuations in the museum environment, where one graph records temperature and the other graph records relative humidity. And it's graphed against time, so you can actually tell at what points during the day or during the week or month you are seeing changes in relative humidity. For example, if you have a huge exhibition opening and there are a lot of people that attend, and you notice a change in the temperature or humidity, that lets you know that maybe for future exhibition openings you might want to check what's going on with the HVAC before everyone arrives. Now, relative humidity is a measure of the amount of moisture in the air. Because many organic materials contain moisture, fluctuations in temperature and relative humidity can cause these materials to expand and contract as they take in or lose moisture. Also, as temperatures rise, the rate of many chemical reactions speed up, and as a result, speed up the rate at which damage can occur in fibers, dyes, and other component materials of textiles. This is a double hemisphere map sampler, which is a silk embroidery on a silk ground, which has been stretched and nailed to a wooden strainer and then framed. It has endured many problems, including fluctuations in temperature and humidity. And the result is brittle, flaking silk. Smog, car exhaust, and ozone are common pollutants that can cause physical and chemical damage. Textiles are particularly susceptible to abrasion and physical damage caused by dust and other gritty particulate surface soiling. This is a silk pile carpet with gold-wrapped threads that spent several years in an environment before air filtration and air conditioners. And this is a detail of the gold-wrapped threads. You can see that the grit has collected in the intricacies, kind of all in through here. And in fact, I should tell you that it took me a while to realize that they were actually metal-wrapped threads. And by looking at the reverse, it was much more apparent. The gold is hardly identifiable and obviously has quite a bit of silver in the mix, as it is quite tarnished. The dust is abrasive and has actually worn away the metal in some areas to reveal the thread core. Eliminating exposure to these contaminants is an important aspect of preventive conservation care. Museums use particulate air filters and protective display cases and storage enclosures to reduce this risk. And here you can see that these textiles are actually sandwiched between acid-free tissue paper in a drawer in an enclosed cabinet. Light is strategically used throughout a museum for effect and visitors' enjoyment, but it is also kept to a minimum while the object is not on view to preserve the longevity of dyes and fragile materials such as silk. All light is damaging, not just ultraviolet light. In the UV and visible light range, photochemical reactions occur which can break bonds in fibers and dyes. In the infrared range, the heat produced can make fibers brittle and dry, as well as accelerate other reactions. And this graph shows how different light wavelengths and how they are produced. And so you can see right up here where the sources of light are coming from and where they fall within the graph of the wavelength spectrum. And usually museums try to block out the lower wavelengths, which are the most damaging. And that's why many textiles are shown behind plexiglass and usually UV-coated, protected plexiglass. Textiles that have not been protected often exhibit fading. These are images of textiles that have differential fading due to being partially covered and partially overexposed. So you can see in this textile where it was folded to the reverse, and this is the area that, of course, received the overexposure. This one is a little more curious. It appears that perhaps it was hung by the neck and that these green and more brown areas were actually protected by being folded and the way that the textile draped. To avoid outbreaks of pest infestation, museums employ good housekeeping. And that's not just keeping things tidy, but also segregating food from galleries and storage to prevent pest outbreaks. Some of the most common museum pests include webbing clothes moths and carpet beetle. Clothes moths and carpet beetles are among the very few insects, fungi, and microorganisms that are capable of digesting keratin, a protein component of feathers, fur, hair, wool, horns, antlers, hooves, nails, beaks, most of your natural history collections, and a lot of artwork. Clothes moths, however, prefer to feed on items contaminated with organic materials such as spilled food, body fluids, fungal spores, or pollen. And in fact, a lot of wool uniforms tend to exhibit a lot of pest damage, usually like around the collar or underarms or at the interior at the lining. This image up here shows the various life stages of the clothes moth. So we have our eggs, our larva, and our adult moth. Now the larva is the one that causes the most damage because really its only function is to eat and get fat. Though you might consider mothballs for your garage or garden, museums do not use them with historic textiles. Mothballs contain either naphthalene or paradichlorobenzene as their active ingredients. Both chemicals are fumigants, meaning that their volatile chemicals will vaporize at lower temperatures, such as room temperature. They are good at killing clothes moths, but they can also kill us. In fact, small children who breathe in the vapors can often get a form of acute anemia. They're also known carcinogens. And if mothballs come in contact with your textile, they not only have a terrible smell that is difficult to remove, but it can also leave stains or cause dyes to shift. And for historic textiles, that means that it's impossible to do analysis on them. Did I go too far? No, I did not. As I have mentioned, the first line of defense is good housekeeping. That means keeping the art away from the food path and keeping storage areas clean. Textiles are often given a surface cleaning before they are put into long-term storage. And here, a conservator uses a screen to vacuum a textile, and that's done so that any loose fibers are not sucked up into the vacuum. You can also use a rheostat on your vacuum, which will lower the amount of power or suction that is used for the vacuum. Sometimes disaster strikes. The way museums take care of pest outbreaks is to kill the pests through freezing or anoxia treatments. If the textile is small enough to fit safely and does not have fragile embellishments like early plastic buttons, for example, it can be put in a deep freezer at minus 26 degrees Celsius for about 3 days. Or if you're really concerned about it, you can bring it up to room temperature to try and trick the bugs into thinking it's spring, come out of any dormancy, and then put it right back in to freeze it. And that usually will kill all the cycles of the bugs. For large textiles and mixed media, or if the entire collection is at risk, an anoxic chamber is more efficient. The chamber is filled with approximately 60% carbon dioxide, leaving just enough oxygen so the bugs do not go dormant. And then after 6 weeks, they die from dehydration. And then comes the cleanup. It is imperative to remove evidence of pest activity in order to monitor the collection and be able to tell if something is a new infestation. For example, here is a perak, which is a headdress for women in Ladakh, which is near the Himalayas in India. The headdress was sent to a carbon dioxide chamber, and the bugs were dead, but you can see the damage to the lamb's wool ear flaps. It's the larva grazed along the hide, right at the base of the hair. So the headdress was vacuumed and the larvae removed with tweezers so that the headdress could be monitored for any possible pest problems in the future. And here you can gauge the actual size of the larvae by comparing it to the mouth of the tweezers. They're kind of ugly. The last element in the collection care aspect from a conservation point of view is storage and handling. This is actually where a textile can be damaged most. Textiles are generally unable to support themselves and require support in a manner that distributes its weight evenly. A delicate archaeological fragment may be housed on a support board with a window mat. The beauty of this is that the textile does not get flexed or directly handled when moved from storage or viewed by students during a lecture. Oversized textiles can be a challenge. A heavier textile, such as a carpet or tapestry, is best rolled on a large tube. And here I just want to point out that yes, it is being rolled face out, and I'll talk a little bit more about that soon, and it's rolled in the direction of the pile. And if you have fringe, you can use tissue to align your fringe and get it so that it goes straight onto your roll. This is a kilim, which has a linen support lining, and it is rolled face out to prevent the kilim from becoming creased. So if you think about your fist, if you make a fist like this, you'll notice the interior has these creases from compression, where comparatively the exterior is smooth, and that is the logic that's being used when you roll a textile face out. Some oversized textiles can be stored on a large support board and require more than one person to handle it safely. Textiles can be stored folded, provided the folds are padded to reduce hard creases, and not too many textiles are stacked upon one another. Sharp creases are actually fiber damage and can lead to tears. So I just want to point out with this one, with this dragon robe, the arms are in fact folded back in, but you can see that the tissue has been used to pad out that fold. And I also want to point out over here, this is a very nice feature that they've added a photograph and its accession number information, so you don't actually have to dig through the drawer to find what you're looking for. So by explaining the ideal museum environment, I have shown you examples of the damage that occurs when textiles have been in less than ideal conditions. These are the types of damage I will most likely see as I go through the collection object by object and note its condition. I can categorize the textiles based on its condition alone, but to get a complete picture and to offer the most information that is useful for the museum, it is important to look at how the textile is made and from what fiber type, and to consider the ultimate goal. And that is what I have been doing for this survey. To repeat what I said at the beginning, the goal for the textiles at the JSMA need to spend some time in storage, some time on display, and some time as an educational tool. So let's look at an object as if it were part of the survey. Here is a wedding skirt from the Qing Dynasty, which actually belongs to a private collector. And I chose this as an example because it has a lot of typical damage that you might see in your own collection, and it might even have a similar story. It was purchased while traveling to China at the turn of the 20th century and passed through the family. The current owner remembers her grandmother wearing it at a party once, but mostly it stayed in a cardboard box until her grandmother died. The first thing to do is to describe it and identify the materials. So, okay. The skirt is comprised of two overlapping panels, and actually, this front panel is overlapping another part of the skirt that goes underneath it. And it is joined along the top by a cotton waistband. The panels are orange silk figured gauze weave with appliqued silk embroidered ribbon and silk plain weave trim on the bias. Next comes the condition, just a bold overall statement. For conservators, the terms most used are excellent, and that usually is reserved for objects that appear brand new. Good, meaning structurally sound, but may have minor aesthetic issues. Fair, some minor structural problems, and some aesthetic concerns that would keep it from being displayed without intervention. And poor, major structural and aesthetic problems, and cannot be displayed or safely handled without intervention. And I would put this in the fair category. Next, we note details of the condition. The first thing I notice about this skirt are the crisp creases that prevent the skirt to hang as it should. So I'm looking at things like this, and what I'm not sure what's going on up here, and that these diagonal creases over here. As a special note, because this is costume, which is a term that museums use for clothing in general, it has nothing to do with disguise or Halloween, and in fact that term is called fancy dress. The silhouette of the garment is the most important. Over here. It tells you a lot about where the dress came from, the time period it was fashionable, who would have worn it, and if it is a fake or theatrical costume. This one has a cotton band. There are no additional stitch holes along the top, suggesting that this was how it was originally made, and in fact not altered. The skirt would have been worn in an ensemble similar to this image from this late 19th century postcard. So if this is to be displayed as worn, or as it would have been worn, like on a body, or opened and stitched to a backing board, the creases would need to be reduced to allow proper pleating. Also, for the long-term preservation of the textile, the creases need to be removed so they do not form tears. However, the vertical creases near the top would need to be put in place as they are actually pleats and dictate how the skirt should drape. So in this case, the removal of the vertical creases in favor of physical stability would interfere with the interpretation of the skirt. But the diagonal creases in the plain field do need to go. Conservators reduce creases differently than your dry cleaner. Remember when I mentioned that the changes in humidity cause fibers to swell and contract? Conservators use this to reduce creases by swelling fibers through increasing humidity, which causes the crease to relax. In this slide, the conservator is using an ultrasonic mister to gently introduce water vapor into the textile. She does not use enough to get the textile damp, just enough so it feels cool to the touch and the fibers begin to relax. That area can be put under weight or blocked into place and allowed to come back to ambient humidity. Here the conservator is using an interleaving layer of rime, which is a lightweight non-woven fabric, and glass weights to get the crease in plane. The next thing I notice is that there is a tear underneath the waistband, right in here. Depending on how the fabric is woven and where the tear is and how the textile will be displayed or stored, will determine if the tear is in fact in need of repair. In this example, the fabric is a gauze weave, which means the warps are twisted with each pass of the weft. So you can see that this is what causes the slight gap between the rows, right in here where the twist is. And because of the twist, this is a very stable weave, and the tear will not increase without force. If this were to be displayed hanging on a mannequin as if it had been worn, then the tears would need to be stitched to an underlying fabric for support, or they might increase from gravity. If this is to be displayed on a support board, either stitched, pinned, or with rare earth magnets, it might not be necessary to repair the tear because it will be held stable and in place. All of this is mentioned in the survey to give the institution as much information to make informed decisions about display in the future. There are other areas that appear damaged. The trims are fraying. This type of damage is very typical for this color of trim. In order to achieve this dark black, an iron mordant is used. As the iron ages, it oxidizes and causes damage to the fibers. In conservation, we have a special term for objects that like to destroy themselves. It is called inherent vice. Though the term is rather cool, it is unfortunately terminable, and a conservator can merely slow the inevitable by giving it the best possible conditions. However, to display this, the frayed bits need to be contained. Textile conservators generally use a sheer fabric, usually silk or polyester, that is color matched to the damaged area and placed over the trim and stitched in place using monofilament to hold in the frayed bits. This is actually a detail of a 19th century Chinese woman's collar that is exhibiting a similar problem to the black silk trim as in the skirt that I showed earlier. Here you can see where the frayed silk has been contained with an overlay of dyed sheer silk fabric called crepeline. This textile is also somewhat faded, which you can see when you compare the front to the interior. Actually, it's rather subtle, but you can see it in the areas of loss behind the frayed trim. Unfortunately, there isn't a good solution for this, and the skirt is now a grubby melon color rather than a vibrant orange. And yes, it is grubby, particularly at the waistband. But in this case, it is not a good candidate for cleaning beyond surface cleaning. The reason is due to the type of soiling combined with the deteriorating black dye. This grubby kind of soiling, oh, I already said that. Because what actually happens is it actually kind of goes acidic, slightly acidic with aging, and means it will not get clean without using water. If this were put in a water bath, the pH of the water would go slightly acidic as the acid degradation products get washed away from the textile. In slightly acidic conditions, the iron changes from Fe2 to Fe3, which is water soluble, which means you are more than likely going to have some dye bleeding. Not to mention that the fibers are pretty weak overall and would most likely break and detach just from being immersed in water. Actually, when you put something in water, it gains a lot of weight, and just moving it becomes very, very fragile. So what are the treatment options? Surface clean using a vacuum with variable suction and microattachments. Humidify and block to reduce creases. And consider supporting the tear with a sheer silk underlay and laid and couched stitches. And encapsulate the black trim with a sheer silk fabric to match the color of the trim. Display options include a rigid support. The textile could be secured with stitches, insect pins, or rare earth magnets to a fabric-covered padded support board, such as this one. Or display it on a mannequin with or without the rest of the costume, such as this one. And as for storage, it is best to try to keep it in a configuration that will promote safe handling and avoid future conservation. For this piece, I would recommend to store it flat on a support board, folded such that the front and back panels are in their correct placement. And if possible, nothing would be placed on top, or at least not stacked more than 2 high. This textile is strong enough to be handled by museum staff for educational purposes, provided it is supported on a board for transport and held only by someone trained in handling art. For example, this is a curator giving a seminar to docents on proper care and handling of textiles. All of the observations and recommendations I have been making for each textile are recorded in the museum's computer database for the staff to use. An overall summary will also be written, which can be used for future grant writing and fundraising, which will allow the museum to continue to develop their textile program. On behalf of the textile collection, I would like to thank the Jordan Schnitzer Museum of Art and the Institute of Museums and Library Services for making this survey possible. Personally, I would like to thank Jill Hartz for approving the survey as a necessary step in the preservation of the collection, and Rose Kitagawa for putting the collection in context for me as I continue the survey, Chris White for facilitating the survey throughout the process and on a daily basis amongst his myriad tasks, Miranda Callender for helping me just find stuff in the basement, and Hanju, Sarah Gordon, Helen Blackmore, and Faith Kresge for assisting with the survey and not only scribing my observations, but also keeping me honest by asking questions. And Sharon Kaplan for organizing this talk. Thank you. And I would be happy to take any questions you might have regarding this survey, or if you have questions about caring for your own collection.
So, can you talk about some of the most surprising things you found?
Oh, where to start? I don't know. I should have thought of, come with some examples. Yesterday's? Yesterday's. Yesterday's? Oh, which? The Mongolian one? Or the large pieces that we were looking at? The garden scene. Oh yeah, it is. No, that's okay. Well, see, that is the thing that is very interesting, because I often get questions about, oh, what did you see, what did you like? And I am so embarrassed to say this, but as a conservator, when I go to museums, I look at mounts. I look at I look at techniques, and I often, when I'm writing condition reports, I have to remind myself to put down the color. One of the people that I mentioned, Faith Kresge, was saying, well, can I just put down, can I describe the iconography? And I said, You can, but to be honest, I'm a generalist, and I know a lot about materials science and chemistry, but to put actually what I'm seeing as the iconography or the scene on the textile, I can't really do that as well as Anne Rose or Han or some. So I try to just say what I see, and what I see, unfortunately, is often the damage. and I'm always trying to think about how to fix it and how we could improve it, and I'm kind of a MacGyver that way. So I unfortunately, some of the things that we've seen, what I've been really enjoying is looking at some of the things and working with the students and the curators, because they point out things and it explains why the damage might be a certain way from use, or if we look at something and I see some damage and I don't think that that's the way it's supposed to be, then we can say, oh yes, that's because of the way that it was displayed previously or how it had been stored before it came to the museum or something like that. So to actually pinpoint from an actual art object, I am not very good at that. Yes, sir?
Say something about how the materials have changed, if at all, over centuries. I mean, is modern silk the same as silk that was used hundreds of years ago? Quality is changed?
Chemically, it's the same because it's from the same critter. However, there are changes or differences regionally and depending on the diet of the worm, and also how it's processed, and then what happens to it afterwards. So the technology is pretty much the same, because unless you're making something synthetic, it's still the same fibroin that's coming from the little worm. But after that, there have been changes in the processing. So for example, there was a time when silk was basically currency, and it was more valuable the more it weighed. So that during the 19th century, there was a practice of adding metal salts to the silk to make it heavier, which is unfortunately inherent vice. And what happens is the salts continue to eat the silk, basically, and you end up with, you can even, if you hold it up, it looks like someone has taken their nails and gone down the silk. It just shreds. So, so that's a change. But in terms of the actual technology, it hasn't really changed that much. Yes?
Showed different ways to display.
Mm-hmm.
If you have a kimono and you want to display it at home,
Mm-hmm.
you don't have a mannequin, and you don't want to just tuck it away, you want to have people see it.
You want to see it?
Is there a way to hang it so that it's nicely shown, saying it?
Right, she's asking for some suggestions on how to hang a kimono safely in her home. The first thing you want to do is choose where you want to put it in your home, and I would recommend an interior wall. And what I mean by that is a wall that is not directly on the outside, because that's what's going to get the most changes in temperature and relative humidity. You also don't want to have it anywhere near a window that's going to put direct sunlight on it. So choose something more towards the interior of your home. And then if it's a kimono that's actually has a straight shoulder or an arm, you can use a plexiglass rod that goes through and have it attached to the wall with a little bit of space so it's not entirely clamped against the wall. And then you might also want to consider what the actual environment in your home is. If you have smokers or if you use an open fireplace, you might want to actually consider having it framed outside of your home and brought in so that it's behind plexiglass. And I suggest plexiglass over glass because of the weight. So you'll want to check your wall to make sure that it will actually support something like that. But also, being from California, I'm always concerned about earthquakes, and plexiglass won't have the same issues that glass will. So that's one way that you could do it. You could also have it as a T-bar, or you could consider, and I think you can also, if you put the rod through it, you can consider how you would like to show it traditionally, with it open towards the wall, with it open up. Is that right? Which makes it a little more difficult because then you have to figure out how you're going to secure the opening.
So plexiglass, it would be like a box made out of plexiglass and you hang it within that?
Yes, you could. We're getting a little more technical. We can talk personally after that. But in general, as long as the textile is strong enough along the seams or along the shoulders, you can hang it by a plexiglass rod. That might be one way to consider. There are several other options. Any other questions? Yes?
Were there any surprises for you as a textile specialist, but not an Asian textile specialist, focusing on Asian textiles? Were there any, obviously they're textiles and they have a lot of the same issues, but were there any good, bad challenges?
Good, bad challenges. The question being, looking at this as a generalist and looking at Asian textiles specifically, did I notice any kind of, or was I surprised by anything? And it's probably because I'm speaking in front of people, and later on I'll come up with several. Oh, actually there was one that was kind of cool. When we first started, we were, like I said, we were looking at sleeve bands, and that's in fact what kind of inspired one of the rotations. And we came across some of the materials that were used were different than what I was expecting, including peacock feathers, the really, really beautiful. So it kind of looked like almost iridescent chenille, the way that it was used. Yes?
Well, I guess this is a question for Amber Rose, but so you talked about assessing the collection. Can you speak a little bit about what is next in terms of implementing the recommendations that have changed? What do we, the choices as a Schnitzer have to be?
Well, we kind of knew what we were doing when we thought that good, because we knew that our collection needs attention. And we knew that you can't just go back to someone like, to an entity like IMLS and say, we have a big collection and we need some help. They need to quantify and have a specialist quantify what needs to be done. So we get major specialist comes in, does this assessment, so that we can quantify and say, we need hundreds of thousands of dollars for acid-free boxes, appropriate tissue. We actually need to expand our building in order to accommodate the expanded storage, because as always happens with textile collections, they tend to be mush. They're just more in a smaller space than they are comfortable. Beth's surveys of our Asian collection have colored every gallery rotation since she got here. All of the textiles that we've put out have been, oh my God, we had no idea we had this fabulous new room. Let's put that in the Japanese theater exhibition. Han worked with Beth and did that lovely selection of sleeve bands and rank badges. I don't know, can you go back to the image of you all surveying? I'm trying to think, I did a presentation yesterday and had a full image of that textile. The kind of troubleshooting that hopefully you never think about when you come to the art museum is what happens when we find a terrific textile. We planned our next gallery rotation in a Chinese gallery, as it has to do with images of the Chinese garden. We found this enormous textile. The textile is about as tall as this room is wide. And so what you're seeing is the three of them sitting by one edge of it.
I'm sorry, I don't know how to get there faster.
That's fine. And the textile is so huge, it's tapestry, and it's backed with cloth. So it is fragile and heavy and huge. And so we've had a lot of discussion since with Beth about, oh, we could use rare earth magnets. I've never used rare earth magnets to hang anything. And then talking with Joey, our head of prep, to try and figure out how do we do that? And all the different possibilities. You can put screws into the wall and then your textile in front of it and try and get the magnets on top of the screws. You can put sheet metal against the wall. And so we're doing a lot of thinking of, oh no, this is the perfect thing for the next show, but it's 18 feet tall, and we have to figure out how to make it happen in our galleries.
Yeah. For this textile specifically, it becomes heavy just because of its size. Overall, it's structurally in good condition. However, in an area that you can't see, there is some weft loss, leaving some bare warps. And traditionally, tapestry is displayed by using Velcro along the top edge, where Velcro is machine stitched to a cotton tape, and then the cotton tape is hand stitched in between the warps and wefts of the textile that you are trying to display. Because this is so large, and because it becomes very fragile at the end, that's not the best solution for this. And that is why we were trying to come up with, that's why we're brainstorming, well, what about magnets? Magnets are often being used in museum display, and in fact, in the Burmese court costume that I showed you, that's actually attached to its mount by rare earth magnets. The problem with that is, again, its size, and we would need a lot of magnets. And that may not be, from a health and safety standpoint, may not be the best option. So we're trying to figure out different ways to go about it.
We had a conversation at lunchtime about, so if we get that many magnets, won't we just make it be all? And how do we get them off of each other? It's just really basic pragmatic things, besides the very rarefied things that we have to worry about. Right. But these are great problems to have. And I can't thank Beth enough for all the hard work that she's done in bringing our collection back to life.
And one of the things actually that will come at the end of this survey is we'll discuss more about what the priorities are for the collection and try to map out action steps. Like Anne Rose was saying, she can't just go, okay, we did the survey, give us more money. We need to plot out, well, we identified that this area of the collection is in the most need, and if we just had this much, we would be able to buy 2 new cabinets plus the materials needed to store it properly and fund interns to come and do the work, something like that, for example. So those are kind of what's on the agenda.
So that is surveying everything and assessing in terms of a number. So a number of 1 through 5, and 1 is great.
0 through 5.
5 is terrible condition. Likewise, we have to go through from a curatorial standpoint and say, condition-wise, it's a 1. Curatorial priority-wise, it's a 3. And then it's the 1, or it's the things that are in bad condition and are really curatorially important that we would like to especially focus on, so that we can kind of expand what we can show of our existing collections, but are not safe to show now. Very important work.
If I just can ask one more question. You showed some repairs, but can you do anything about that fading, that horrible fading that you showed, or would you ever suggest that somebody does something?
You can't, unfortunately. Light damage is irreversible. And the question being, can you try and bring back the color? There have actually been discussions amongst textile conservators about using filtered or colored lights. But I think I showed you in that graph, it showed, it actually graphed out the colors of the spectrum and where they fall within the wavelengths. So if you use, so for example, you had the orange textile and we wanted to make it look more orange, at least under, in a museum exhibition. And so we put an orange light on it. The problem with that is then that promotes absorption in the other wavelength areas. So you can actually be promoting fading to a different color rather than its natural progression towards whatever color it's going to, melon. It's a little bit beyond what I can explain chemistry-wise, but there are conservation scientists who are working with textile conservators on that very problem, because it is a problem You have, especially for museums that don't have a deep collection, but they have something that is so loved by the public that they complain every time it goes off view. You know, how do you try and, what are the options then for, besides going out and purchasing 3 more dragon robes? You know, how can we still show it and still have it look the way that we want it to, besides putting up maybe a fake? You can't. Put up a poster. Not quite the same, though, is it? Not quite the same as the actual textile. Okay.
Thank you so much.
Thank you very much for having me.